As the flight attendant called for first-class passengers to board, Anthony adjusted the strap of his worn leather duffel bag and stepped into line. He was a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 30s with a kind smile that belied his sharp wit. Anthony had worked hard for his success, rising from humble beginnings to become the youngest partner at a prestigious law firm. Flying first class wasn't an everyday luxury for him, but this trip marked the culmination of years of perseverance, and he was determined to enjoy it. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, families reuniting, hurried travelers rushing to catch flights, and announcements echoing overhead. Anthony couldn't help but notice a young woman sitting nearby, her face pale and anxious, her hand resting protectively on her very pregnant belly. She looked exhausted, clutching a boarding pass as she kept glancing at the clock. Her economy boarding group was still several announcements away, and the thought of her struggling through the cramped, crowded cabin weighed on Anthony's mind. Moments later, as Anthony was settling into his plush seat, sipping water served in a real glass, he saw her again. She shuffled past the first-class cabin, her pace slow, her discomfort evident. It struck him then, this woman, this stranger, was someone's daughter, someone's partner, and soon, someone's mother. Without overthinking, Anthony rose from his seat and flagged down the flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but kind. "I'd like to switch seats with that woman. She's pregnant and looks like she could use the space." The attendant blinked, taken aback. Passengers around him turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes. A first-class seat wasn't a casual offering. But Anthony wasn't looking for acknowledgement or applause. He simply wanted to help. The woman hesitated when the attendant approached her, explaining the unexpected offer. "Are you sure?" she asked Anthony, her voice soft but wary, as if she couldn't believe a stranger's generosity. "Absolutely," he replied with a warm smile. "You and your baby need this more than I do." With that, Anthony grabbed his bag and made his way to the back of the plane. The economy section was packed and noisy, a stark contrast to the serene first-class cabin. Anthony didn't mind. He tucked himself into the narrow seat, his long legs awkwardly angled, and opened a book, content with his decision. But as the flight progressed, something unusual caught his attention. Sitting across the aisle were two men in suits, their conversation too hushed to be casual. They kept glancing around, their voices low but intense. Anthony's sharp mind, honed from years of legal practice, picked up on their guarded behavior. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When one of the men dropped his phone, Anthony caught a glimpse of the screen. A series of encrypted messages flashed before it went dark. His instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a random exchange between colleagues. It felt calculated, deliberate. Anthony didn't know what they were discussing, but the tension in their demeanor hinted at something far bigger than a business deal. As the flight landed and passengers began to disembark, Anthony kept his eyes on the two men. They moved with purpose, their briefcases clutched tightly. It wasn't until he saw one of them subtly pass a small USB drive to the other that Anthony's suspicions solidified. Something illegal was happening, and he had inadvertently placed himself in the middle of it. Anthony hadn't planned on being a hero that day. All he wanted was to do something kind for a stranger. But as he stepped off the plane, his mind raced with questions. Who were these men? What was on that USB drive? And why did his simple act of generosity feel like the start of something far more dangerous? Little did Anthony know, his decision to give up his first-class seat would unravel a $100 million criminal conspiracy, and his life would never be the same again. Anthony stepped off the plane, his mind swirling with unease. The two men in suits had vanished quickly into the crowd, blending seamlessly with the sea of travelers rushing through the terminal. He clutched his duffel bag tightly, his eyes darting around as if he might spot them again. Part of him wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to overthinking or his imagination running wild. But another part of him, the part that had built a career on trusting his instincts, couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something important. As he made his way toward the baggage claim, Anthony replayed the scene in his head. The men's hushed conversation, the furtive glances, and that USB drive exchange. They all pointed to something bigger. He couldn't help but wonder if he was overstepping his bounds. After all, he was a lawyer, not a detective. But he also knew that ignoring his instincts could mean missing the chance to prevent something terrible. He grabbed his suitcase from the carousel and headed for the exit, but as he passed a coffee shop, he froze. One of the men from the plane was inside, seated at a corner table with a laptop open in front of him. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just his imagination. This was real. He ducked behind a pillar, watching as the man typed furiously, occasionally glancing over his shoulder. Anthony's pulse quickened. He debated what to do. Should he confront the man? Call the authorities? Or was it smarter to gather more information first? His thoughts were interrupted when the man stood up abruptly, closing his laptop and slipping it into his bag. Anthony knew this was his chance. He followed at a safe distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. The man walked briskly through the terminal, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Anthony stayed close, his legal mind racing to piece together what he knew. If these men were involved in something illegal, the USB drive was likely the key. But what could it contain? Financial records? Classified information? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. The man exited the terminal and headed toward a parking structure. Anthony hesitated, unsure if he should continue. Following someone out of an airport was risky, and he didn't want to put himself in danger. But just as he was about to turn back, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. The other man from the plane was waiting by a sleek black car, holding a phone to his ear. When he saw the first man approach, he ended the call and opened the trunk. Anthony ducked behind a row of parked cars, his heart pounding. The two men exchanged a few words, their voices too low for him to hear. Then, the first man handed over the USB drive. The second man examined it briefly before slipping it into his pocket. Anthony's suspicions were confirmed. This was no ordinary business transaction. He pulled out his phone, debating whether to take a photo or record a video. But before he could decide, the men got into the car and drove off, leaving him standing alone in the parking structure. Frustrated, Anthony pocketed his phone and made his way to the rideshare pickup zone. He needed time to think and figure out his next move. On the ride to his hotel, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. He had no evidence, no clear idea of what he was dealing with, and no way to involve the authorities without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd seen. His gut told him that this was the beginning of something much larger, and he had a role to play in uncovering it. Later that evening, as he sat in his hotel room, Anthony began to research. He searched for news articles, trying to find any mention of criminal activity that might be connected to what he'd witnessed. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he stumbled upon a story that sent chills down his spine. A tech company had recently reported a massive security breach, with sensitive data stolen from their servers. The breach had been traced back to a group of hackers known for selling stolen information on the black market. The timing of the breach and the behavior of the men on the plane seemed too coincidental to ignore. Could the USB drive contain the stolen data? Anthony leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If the men were part of this hacking group, they could be involved in something much bigger than a simple theft. The stolen data could include anything from financial information to personal details of millions of people. The implications were staggering, but why had this fallen into his lap? Anthony couldn't help but think back to the pregnant woman he'd given his seat to. If he hadn't been in economy, he never would have noticed the men. It was as if fate had put him in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place, depending on how he looked at it. As he stared out the window, the city lights twinkling below, Anthony knew he had a decision to make. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and go back to his normal life. Or he could dig deeper, risking his own safety to uncover the truth. The choice weighed heavily on him, but one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The next morning, Anthony decided to take a calculated risk. He reached out to a trusted friend, Alina, who worked in cybersecurity. If anyone could help him make sense of what he'd seen, it was her. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, he recounted the events of the previous day, leaving out no detail. Alina listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. "You're not imagining things," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, this could be part of a much larger operation. These kinds of data breaches are often linked to organized crime or even state-sponsored groups." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "You need to be careful, Anthony. If these people are who I think they are, they won't hesitate to protect themselves. But if you want to pursue this, you'll need evidence. Without it, no one will take you seriously." Her words stayed with him as he left the cafe. Anthony knew she was right. He needed proof, and he needed to be smart about how he got it. But as he walked through the bustling streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever these men were planning, it was already in motion, and he was the only one who could stop it. Anthony walked briskly through the city streets, Elena's warning replaying in his mind. He couldn't afford to act recklessly, but every second that passed felt like an opportunity slipping through his fingers. If these men were involved in something as dangerous as a criminal syndicate or a black market data trade, then the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. He decided to start by retracing his steps. The airport had security cameras everywhere. If he could access the footage, it might show the exchange of the USB drive, or at least provide better visuals of the two men. But getting airport security to release such sensitive material wouldn't be easy. He'd need a legitimate reason, and "I saw something suspicious on my flight" wasn't likely to cut it. Anthony made a mental note to return later, but for now, he needed to focus on other leads. He thought about the pregnant woman. He had no idea who she was, but there was a chance she'd noticed something he hadn't. He reached out to the airline under the pretense of a follow-up about the seat switch and asked if they could pass along his contact information to her. It was a long shot, but he hoped she might call. Hours passed without any word from the airline, and Anthony's frustration grew. He returned to his hotel room, pacing back and forth as he tried to figure out his next move. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Sufi. The airline said you wanted to get in touch. Is everything okay?" Anthony quickly replied, explaining as vaguely as possible that he was looking into something from their flight and asking if she'd noticed anything unusual. Her response was almost immediate. "I don't know if this helps, but I did see those two men when I walked by first class. They seemed really intense, like they were arguing. I didn't hear much, but one of them said something about the deadline. It sounded serious." Anthony's pulse quickened. The deadline. It could mean anything, but it confirmed his suspicion that these men were on a tight schedule. He thanked Sophie for her help, careful not to alarm her with too many details. The last thing he wanted was to drag her into something potentially dangerous. Later that night, Anthony received another call, this time from Elena. She had spent the afternoon digging into recent activity related to the data breach he'd mentioned. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as she relayed what she found. "Anthony, this is bigger than I thought. The group behind the breach goes by the name Cipher Core. They're infamous in the cybersecurity world, responsible for some of the largest hacks in recent history. But here's the thing, they don't usually sell their data right away. They auction it off to the highest bidder, often through encrypted networks." Anthony felt a knot form in his stomach. "So you're saying they might have been delivering the data to a buyer?" "Exactly," Elena said. "And if that USB drive contains the stolen data, the buyer could already have it. We might be too late." The weight of her words settled heavily on Anthony's shoulders. If the data was already in the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. He thanked Elena for her help and promised to keep her updated, though he had no idea what his next step would be. The following morning, Anthony decided to visit the law firm where he worked. He needed access to resources, legal databases, contacts in law enforcement, anything that could help him piece together the puzzle. As he entered the sleek, glass-walled building, he felt a twinge of unease. This place, which had always represented stability and order, now felt out of sync with the chaos unfolding in his life. In his office, Anthony began making discreet inquiries. He reached out to a former colleague who now worked for the FBI. framing his questions as hypothetical. The agent, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, immediately picked up on the underlying urgency. "Anthony, what's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp. "You're not the type to ask about encrypted networks and criminal syndicates without a reason." Anthony hesitated. He trusted Carla, but sharing too much could put both of them at risk. "Let's just say I came across something suspicious and I'm trying to figure out if it's worth pursuing." Carla sighed. "Look, if this is connected to Ciprocor, you're treading on dangerous ground. These people don't play games. They have resources, connections, and no qualms about silencing anyone who gets in their way. If you're onto something, you need to step back and let the professionals handle it." But stepping back wasn't an option. Anthony thanked her for her advice and ended the call, more determined than ever to see this through. That evening, as he walked back to his hotel, Anthony felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing unusual. The bustling streets were filled with commuters, tourists, and vendors, all going about their business. Still, the feeling lingered. When he reached his hotel, the front desk clerk handed him an envelope. "This was left for you earlier," she said with a polite smile. Anthony's heart raced as he opened the envelope in the privacy of his room. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Stop asking questions. This is your only warning." The words were stark, devoid of any emotion, but their message was clear. Someone knew he was digging, and they wanted him to stop. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't just chasing shadows anymore. He was being pulled into something far more dangerous than he anticipated. Anthony sat on the edge of the bed, the warning note still clutched in his hand. Every instinct told him to walk away, to let the professionals handle it as Carla had suggested. But he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that he'd already seen too much. If these men were willing to threaten him, what else were they capable of? And what would happen if they succeeded in whatever they were planning? He thought of the pregnant woman, Sophie, and the countless others who might be affected if this criminal operation continued unchecked. The stakes were no longer just about his own safety. They were about protecting others from harm. Anthony knew there was no turning back. The only way out was through. Anthony sat in the dim glow of his hotel room, the warning note spread out on the desk in front of him. The stark, threatening words seemed to pulse with an unspoken menace. His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of how far this had escalated. Someone was watching him. Someone who knew enough about his movements to leave a note at the hotel without being seen. The question wasn't just asterisk who asterisk was behind this. It was also asterisk how asterisk much they knew and asterisk what asterisk they were willing to do to keep him silent. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced through possibilities. Walking away wasn't an option anymore, but staying involved felt like walking into the lion's den. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Alina. "They know I'm asking questions. I got a threat at the hotel." Her reply came almost immediately. "You need to leave the hotel. Now." Anthony hesitated. Moving locations might buy him some time, but it wouldn't solve the problem. He needed to stay one step ahead, and running wouldn't accomplish that. Still, Alina's urgency convinced him to at least take precautions. He packed his things quickly and requested a rideshare to a different part of the city, choosing a modest inn that felt far less conspicuous than the upscale hotel he had been staying in. Once he was settled into the new room, Anthony called Alina. "What do you think they're planning?" he asked, his voice low. "It's hard to say," she replied. "But if they're willing to leave a warning, it means you're getting close to something they don't want you to uncover. That's both good and bad. It means you're on the right track, but it also means they're watching your every move." Anthony exhaled slowly. "So how do I stay ahead of them?" "By being smarter than they expect," Alina said. "We need to figure out what's on that USB drive. If we can find out where it's going or who's involved, we might be able to blow this thing wide open." Anthony thought about the parking structure, the car, and the brief exchange he had witnessed. "The USB drive is the key," he murmured. "I have to figure out where it's being delivered." Alina paused. "You said one of the men had a laptop, right? Did you see anything on the screen?" Anthony closed his eyes, replaying the moment in his mind. It was too quick, but there was a logo on the corner of the screen. It looked like a globe, kind of stylized. That might be enough, Elena said. Send me a sketch of it if you can. He grabbed a notebook and sketched out the logo as best as he could remember. After snapping a photo and sending it to Elena, he waited in tense silence for her response. Minutes felt like hours as he stared at his phone, half expecting another warning message to pop up. Finally, Elena called back. I think I got something. That logo matches a company called Global Secure, a tech firm specializing in encryption software. If CipherCore has a connection to them, it could explain how they've been pulling off these breaches. Anthony frowned. Why would a legitimate tech company be involved with criminals? That's what we need to find out, Elena said. It could be an inside job, or they could be using Global Secure as a front. Either way, we're getting closer. Anthony nodded, his determination solidifying. How do we get inside? You don't, Elena said firmly. Not yet, at least. Let me do some digging first. If we're going to make a move, we need to be prepared. As Anthony ended the call, a new sense of urgency coursed through him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. Every lead brought him closer to the truth, but it also brought him closer to danger. The next day, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. It was subtle, a shadow lingering a moment too long, a figure in the crowd that seemed familiar. He doubled back several times, taking different routes and ducking into shops to throw off anyone who might be trailing him. By the time he returned to his room, he was certain someone was watching him. That night, Elena called again, her voice tinged with excitement. I found something. Global Secure is hosting a private event tomorrow night, a fundraiser at their headquarters. It's invitation only, but if you can get in, you might be able to learn more. Anthony felt a surge of hope, tempered by the weight of what she was asking. How am I supposed to get an invitation? Elena hesitated. Leave that to me. I have a contact who owes me a favor. I can get you on the guest list, but you'll need to be careful. If anyone recognizes you or suspects why you're there, you're done. The plan was risky, but it was the best lead they had. Anthony agreed, and Elena promised to send him the details by morning. As he prepared for the event, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment everything had been leading to. The fundraiser was his chance to get closer to the truth, but it was also a trap waiting to spring. He packed his things carefully, choosing items that wouldn't raise suspicion but could still prove useful: a notebook, a pen with a built-in camera, and his phone with a secure recording app. When the night of the event arrived, Anthony felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Dressed in a sharp suit that Elena had insisted on, he looked every bit the part of a successful professional attending a high-profile fundraiser. But beneath the polished exterior, his mind was a whirlwind of nerves and strategy. The Global Secure headquarters was an imposing glass building, its sleek design reflecting the city lights. Anthony handed his invitation to the security guard at the entrance, his heart pounding as he waited for the man to scan it. After what felt like an eternity, the guard nodded and waved him through. Inside, the atmosphere was a blend of opulence and professionalism. Guests mingled in the spacious lobby, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Anthony scanned the room, his eyes landing on a group of executives near the stage. Among them was a man he recognized instantly. It was one of the men from the plane. His breath caught in his throat. The man was laughing, his demeanor relaxed, as if he weren't part of a dangerous conspiracy. Anthony kept his distance, blending in with the crowd as he tried to observe without drawing attention to himself. As the night wore on, Anthony spotted several other people who seemed to be part of the same circle. They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, their conversations punctuated by discreet gestures and occasional glances toward a secured door at the back of the room. Anthony's curiosity burned. Whatever was happening behind that door was the key to the mystery. He edged closer, keeping an eye on the guards stationed nearby. Just as he was considering how to gain access, the man from the plane glanced in his direction. Their eyes met briefly, and Anthony felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. He turned quickly, pretending to admire a nearby display, but he could feel the man's gaze lingering. The tension in the room thickened. Anthony knew he had been seen, and the stakes had just risen. Whatever he was about to uncover, it was now or never. Anthony's heart pounded in his chest as he turned away, willing himself to stay calm. The man from the plane was now watching him, and Anthony knew it wasn't just a passing glance. He could feel the weight of suspicion bearing down on him like a spotlight in a dark room. The secure door at the back of the room beckoned to him, but now it seemed further out of reach. One wrong move, and the entire operation would come crashing down. He casually moved toward a nearby display table, pretending to study the intricate technology showcase as part of the fundraiser's theme. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man approach one of the guards. They exchanged a few words, and the guard's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Anthony. Anthony swallowed hard and adjusted his tie, feigning nonchalance. He needed to act fast. Just then, a commotion erupted near the bar. A waiter had dropped a tray of glasses, sending champagne and shards of crystal scattering across the floor. The distraction was enough to draw the guard's attention, and Anthony seized the opportunity. Slipping through the crowd, he maneuvered toward the secure door, careful to stay out of the man's line of sight. As he neared the door, he noticed a small keypad next to it. His stomach sank. There was no way he'd be able to guess the code. But then, fate intervened. A woman in an evening gown approached the door, entering the code with quick precision before stepping inside. Anthony caught a glimpse of the sequence, 2147, just before the door clicked shut. He hesitated for a split second, knowing the risk, but the pull of the truth was too strong. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure he wasn't being followed, he punched in the code. The lock released with a quiet beep, and Anthony slipped through the door, closing it softly behind him. The hallway beyond was a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere of the fundraiser. It was cold, sterile, and eerily quiet, with fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the polished floor. Anthony moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the carpet runner that stretched down the corridor. At the end of the hall, he found another door slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, he saw a small conference room filled with monitors and laptops. Several people were seated around the table, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screens. In the center of the table was the man from the plane, speaking in a low, urgent tone. Anthony strained to hear, catching fragments of their conversation. Timeline is tight. The buyer is expecting delivery within the hour. We can't afford any mistakes, another voice said. The data's value diminishes if we're late. Anthony's mind raced. They were finalizing the deal, and the delivery was imminent. But what shocked him even more was the presence of someone he hadn't expected. Sophie, the pregnant woman from the flight. She was seated at the far end of the table, her expression unreadable as she tapped on a tablet. What was she doing here? Was she involved, or was she a victim like him? Before he could process the implications, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the hallway, it felt deafening. Anthony froze as the man at the table looked up sharply. "Did you hear that?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing. Anthony backed away from the door, his pulse racing. He needed to get out of there before they discovered him. Turning quickly, he retraced his steps down the corridor, careful to avoid making any noise. Just as he reached the exit, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Someone had followed him. He pushed through the door and re-entered the bustling event, blending into the crowd as seamlessly as he could. The festive chatter and laughter felt surreal after the tension of the hallway. Anthony grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, hoping to look like just another guest. Moments later, the man from the plane emerged from the secured door, scanning the room. His eyes swept over Anthony, lingering for a moment before moving on. Anthony forced himself to remain calm, even as his mind raced. Sophie's presence in that room was a twist he hadn't anticipated, and it raised more questions than answers. Was she working with them, or was she being used? Anthony's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Alina. "I found something you need to see. Check your email." Excusing himself, Anthony slipped into a quiet corner and opened the email. Alina had sent a series of documents, internal memos from Global Secure that detailed the development of a cutting-edge encryption algorithm. The memos hinted at a partnership with an unnamed third party, but what caught Anthony's attention was the mention of a potential breach within the company. Alina had highlighted a key line. Preliminary investigations suggest insider involvement in the unauthorized transfer of proprietary data. An insider. That could explain how CipherCore had access to the encryption technology, but it didn't explain Sophie's role. Was she the insider? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? As Anthony pondered the implications, he noticed a commotion near the entrance of the event. A group of uniformed security personnel had entered the room, their expressions grim. The man from the plane was speaking with them, gesturing toward the crowd. Anthony's chest tightened as he realized they were searching for him. He needed to act fast. Slipping out through a side exit, he found himself in a dimly lit alley behind the building. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the tension that gripped his chest. Pulling out his phone, he called Alina. "They're on to me," he said, his voice tight. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." "Anthony, listen to me," Alina said urgently. "You need to get out of there. But first, we need to confirm something." "Sophie, the pregnant woman from the plane, she's not who you think she is." Anthony's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She's not just a bystander," Alina continued. "I ran her name through some databases. She's connected to CipherCore. And not just as an associate. She's one of their lead operatives." The revelation hit Anthony like a freight train. Sophie, the woman he had given up his first-class seat for, the woman who had seemed so innocent and grateful, was working for the very organization he was trying to expose. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift, forming a new and far more dangerous picture. Before he could respond, the alley filled with the sound of approaching footsteps. Anthony turned to see two men in suits rounding the corner, their faces cold and determined. They weren't here to talk. "Anthony," Alina said urgently, her voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Run." Anthony sprinted down the alley, his breaths sharp and shallow as the sound of footsteps behind him grew louder. The men pursuing him weren't amateurs. Their pace was steady, their movements calculated. He darted around a corner, his eyes scanning desperately for an escape route. A stack of crates led to a low rooftop, and without thinking, he clambered up, his fingers scraping against the rough wood as he hauled himself over the edge. Flattening himself against the rooftop, Anthony peered over the side. The two men had stopped below, their eyes searching the alley. One of them pulled out a phone, speaking in clipped tones. "He's on foot. Send back up to the south exit." Anthony's pulse raced as he realized he was running out of time. Staying on the rooftop wasn't an option. They'd surround him within minutes. He crept to the other side of the building, scanning the street below. A delivery truck idled near the curb, its driver unloading packages. Anthony climbed down silently, dropping into the shadows before slipping behind the truck. He waited until the driver disappeared inside the building, then quickly climbed into the back and pulled the door shut behind him. The truck rumbled to life moments later, pulling away from the curb. Anthony sat in the dark, his mind racing. Sophie's betrayal felt like a knife to the gut. He had trusted her, even defended her, and now it turned out she was part of the very operation he was trying to stop. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more sinister than he'd imagined. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and he answered it without hesitation. Alina's voice was sharp and urgent. "Where are you?" "In the back of a delivery truck," he said, his voice low. "They're closing in on me." "You need to get to a safe location," Alina said. "But first, listen." I dug deeper into Sophie's connections. She's not just an operative, she's CipherCore's leverage. They're using her to ensure the deal goes through. Anthony frowned. "Leverage how?" "She's not really pregnant," Alina said, her voice heavy with implication. "It's a cover. That's why she's been so protected. They're using her to smuggle something, likely the encryption data itself. The device is hidden in the prosthetic stomach she's wearing." The revelation left Anthony stunned. It was brilliant in its audacity, a perfect disguise that no one would question. But it also meant Sophie was far more involved than he'd realized. She wasn't a victim. She was a key player in the plot. As the truck slowed to a stop, Anthony peered through a crack in the door. They were at a distribution center, and the driver was unloading packages onto a conveyor belt. He slipped out of the truck, blending into the bustle of workers as he made his way to the street. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Elena. Coordinates sent. It's a private airstrip. The deal's going down there. Anthony flagged down a passing cab and gave the driver the coordinates. As the car sped through the city, he mentally prepared himself for what lay ahead. The airstrip was his last chance to stop the transfer and expose Cipher Corps' operation. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The people he was up against were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. When he arrived at the airstrip, the scene was already unfolding. A private jet sat on the tarmac, its engines humming softly. A group of men stood near the plane, their expressions tense as they spoke in hushed tones. Among them was Sophie, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Anthony stayed in the shadows, observing as a sleek black SUV pulled up. The buyer had arrived. A tall, imposing man stepped out, flanked by bodyguards. He exchanged a briefcase with the man from the plane, an unmistakable signal that the deal was underway. Anthony's instincts kicked in. He needed to act fast, but he couldn't do it alone. He dialed Elena, his voice urgent. "I need backup. Can you get someone here?" "Already on it," Elena said. "I tipped off the authorities. They're on their way." As the deal progressed, Anthony edged closer, using the cover of darkness to remain unseen. He could hear fragments of their conversation, confirming that the encryption data was being transferred. Sophie handed the briefcase to the buyer, her movements smooth and practiced. But then, something unexpected happened. Sophie hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the shadows where Anthony was hiding. For a split second, their eyes met, and he saw something he hadn't expected: guilt. Before he could process it, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the airstrip as police vehicles surrounded the scene. The buyers scattered and chaos erupted. Anthony seized the moment, sprinting towards Sophie as she tried to retreat toward the plane. "Stop!" he shouted, grabbing her arm. "It's over." Sophie turned to him, her expression torn. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "They have my family. I didn't have a choice." Anthony stared at her, his anger tempered by the desperation in her voice. Before he could respond, one of Cipher Corps' men lunged at him. They grappled briefly before Anthony managed to knock him out. When he turned back, Sophie was gone, the prosthetic stomach lying discarded on the ground. The authorities swarmed the airstrip, rounding up the remaining operatives. The buyer was taken into custody, along with the man from the plane. Anthony watched as the scene unfolded, relief mingling with exhaustion. But as he walked away, something nagged at him. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. They have my family. If she was telling the truth, it meant Cipher Corps wasn't just a criminal organization. They were coercing people, using their loved ones as leverage. As Anthony stepped into the waiting police car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Cipher Corps' operation had been disrupted, but their network was far-reaching. And somewhere out there, Sophie was still running, haunted by her choices, but alive. The car pulled away from the airstrip, leaving the chaos behind. Anthony stared out the window, a sense of resolve settling over him. This was bigger than he had imagined, and he wasn't done yet. The fight against Cipher Corps was just beginning.